Okay, so in part two of this week's lecture, I'm going to just talk a little bit about some sociological theories and concepts to think critically about consumption. The first section is mostly on what we call the Frankfurt School, that is seen as kind of the inventors of what we call today critical theory, and the last little bit about Daniel Miller, who takes a completely different take from the critical theorists. But again, to begin with, there's some videos there if you're interested in this stuff. Please stop in a moment and have a look at the short Adorno one, which is the first one there. And I've got a couple of kind of longer ones there that also kind of unpack some of the Frankfurt School concepts and work around consumption and the media in particular. So just have a quick look at the Adorno one. I think it only goes for about 7 minutes. Okay, so the Frankfurt School are a kind of group of social theorists. Obviously, in Germany, the school was founded in the early 1920s, and the really big names associated with this school that have had massive effects on the way that theory has kind of developed in the social sciences are people like Theodor Adorno, Walter Benjamin, Herbert Marcuse, Max Horkheimer, Erich Fromm, and the kind of there's still the kind of couple of third or fourth generations of Frankfurt School theorists around today who did their PhDs there. You know, people like Jürgen Habermas and even Axel Honneth have an association with this school. I think it's really important to contextualize the Frankfurt School theorists in terms of their kind of historical time and place. Founded in 1923, the department, was around while Germany was going through, all the changes that led to the Second World War, the rise of Nazism, and really these theorists being radicals and many of them being Jewish were, under real physical danger by staying in the country. So most of them fled. Both Adorno and Marcuse made it to the US. Benjamin was a bit slower to get out, and he actually committed suicide at the border between France and Spain, I think, where he thought he was going to be caught and go to the gulags. So these people were living in a hugely fraught political time, the rise of totalitarianism. But what's interesting about that is that, for instance, when Adorno and Marcuse got to the US, they basically figured the US to be an equally totalitarian society, but rather through the kind of overt political repression that was happening in Germany, they argued that it was the kind of almost complete commercialization of American culture that was providing a kind of different kind of totalitarianism. So these theorists developed, through many books and articles, a whole bunch of work that basically critically engages with capitalism, with consumer society, and with the media, and it's the foundation of what we now call critical theory. They're, as I said before, particularly interested in why the revolution hasn't happened and how does ideology work to keep people in their place. So they particularly understand, why hasn't class consciousness developed, and they, rather than focus on work, they focus on leisure and culture and the media and stuff like that. Adorno coins the term the culture industry to think about this. And for Adorno, the culture industry is the purveyor of ideology. This is the music industry, the film industry, advertising, television. Today you would include things like social media and stuff like that in it. And so they're particularly concerned with how these, leisure practices and consumption practices are ideological mechanisms to make people not think too much and, not revolt. Adorno in particular was interested in what he called pseudo-individualization. And this is the way that consumer culture endows mass-produced things with what he called the halo of free choice. And he argued that culture was increasingly commercialized, and all the Frankfurt School theorists were quite particularly concerned with what this meant for notions of creativity and artistic expression. Because as things become more commercialized, they argue they become more the same, that they become made to be mass-produced, and this has kind of detrimental effects on the way that art is meant to critically engage with things. So in terms of this idea of pseudo-individualization, when you go to the supermarket, when you walk in the aisle with with what used to have toilet paper or, washing powder or whatever, it's really just exactly the same thing in a whole bunch of different coloured boxes. When you go to buy your washing powder, you buy it, but you buy it in this particular coloured box. It's very much the same to the one next to it with whatever kind of PR and advertising paraphernalia is around that to try and make it stand out, I suppose, even though it's exactly the same thing. We can see this in films, a lot of kind of work about, films and even literature talks about how there's only like 5 or 7 or whatever narratives. You can see in the meme on the page there the different ways that, you could, jokingly think about action films and rom-com, but, that's not too far from the truth in many ways. Another way we can think about is with kind of pop music, what's played on the radio, essentially are songs that go verse, chorus, bridge, chorus, finish, or some kind of small, different, formula, but something quite close to that. So for Adorno and the other critical theorists, these kind of mass-produced products produce what it kind of an eternal sameness, and then as ideology kind of builds around these things, the need to keep up, the need to consume more and more to have the right stuff, becomes your way of life rather than thinking about the rations production and how people are kind of exploited by those things. Adorno was particularly interested in the music industry, and if you're kind of somewhat seduced by that idea that the culture industry makes us all stupid, what's important to remember in that is that you can't apply that to the things that you don't like and not apply it to the things that you like. From the Adornian point of view, some kind of radical punk music that's about overthrowing capitalism is probably no different from, the most popular forms of pop music. Despite the fact that one might be saying, overthrow capitalism, the other one might be telling you to buy a particular product. From this perspective, these, texts, these songs, these films are largely still doing the same thing, because all you're doing is listening to them or watching them. You might be getting particular feelings. You might buy something or you might not, but what you're not doing is actually doing anything about changing the world. So that in and of itself is the way that these kind of, the fixation on consuming popular culture in particular, is that sedation has that sedation principle. Marcuse had a little bit of a different take on things. He was particularly interested in the distinction between false and true needs, arguing that, I suppose, as Maslow's hierarchy of needs were increasingly covered in a consumer culture where, at least most people in the Western world, can clothe themselves and eat and have a place to live or whatever, that those true needs are replaced by false needs. And the advertising industry in particular is the key to this, the constant driving to kind of have new stuff. You can see in the Story of Stuff video that kind of, the example between, having wide heels or small heels, or you can think about the way that, shoes come in and out of fashion, or, one year wide ties are fashionable and next year thin ties are fashionable. This is kind of, false needs in that Marcuse sense. For Marcuse, he was also fundamentally concerned with what this meant for language being a key way that ideology is disseminated. Marcuse argued that as societies become more and more sensationalized, and the media itself became more sensationalized, and things like the news have to compete with, neighbours or whatever for people to take it to watch it. This means that language kind of also becomes more and more sensationalized. So you have an example of this would be something like, when there's a report on the Oscars, someone might describe someone's dress as a fashion atrocity. Marcuse's analysis of that kind of means that, if we're going to start using a term like atrocity to describe someone's clothes, how does language therefore have a way of understanding actual atrocities such as, mass murder or genocide and things like that? So for Marcuse, the culture industry was key in terms of getting us to think about the world, differently. and not think about it too critically in the kind of management of language and the increased sensationalizing of it. So the critical theorists were particularly influential on what's called the cultural turn, this kind of shift away from the earlier materialist view of looking at the world, that owners of production and workers and alienation, exploitation and the like, where from the 50s and 60s on, the cultural turn started to get people to think more about consumption practices and the way that we're kind of immersed in the consumer society. And this is how we largely create our self-identities, through the way that we pick and choose products, to dress, to eat, and also we pick and choose the things that we like, such as, the movies and songs and books or whatever. Consumption here is broadened out to think about, much more things other than just eating food. Consumption about eating, but here's a more general kind of way of thinking about consumption, where everything you kind of do, is kind of, you're consuming it. So if you listen to a song through this kind of theory, you're consuming that song. And this is a kind of new way from the 1960s on to think about consumption in that way. So consumerism in this sense has become a way of life through this critical theory. It's a lifestyle. What we consume expresses much about who we are. And by thinking critically about this, we can think critically about the ways that kind of societies work, about how this links to things like unsustainability and waste and all that kind of stuff that the Story of Stuff video, I think, really successfully points out, and that that way of thinking about ourselves and others is done through this kind of consumer system. Now, for some, like the Frankfurt School, this is fundamentally problematic because it turns humans into not their true species being. It distracts us. It makes us concerned with things that aren't that important, and increasingly this is kind of shown to mean that people are anxious and jealous and all these kind of things of others. Modes of happiness, for instance, are going down, that I'll look at in the last part of the lecture. So, in terms of that shift to consumer culture, why do we want to study stuff? Kind of some of the sociological questions around this is how our material surroundings can say a lot about who we are as individuals, as families, as groups, but also in terms of the way those relations happen within a society, say a lot about that society itself. So you can think about this critically and maybe reflexively a little bit. What objects have you bought, and why do you buy them, and what do they say about you? What does your home look like? This space that you live in is kind of often filled with consumer products, and you do pick and choose that stuff somewhat deliberately. That some theorists would say that's ideology kind of impelling you to do that, and others would say that's an actual expression of yourself. There's real debates within social theory about those things. Obviously, the ways people consume is particularly influenced by their class, their gender, their ethnicity, their religion, their location, their society, their sexuality, their disability or whatever. All these things, these contours of inequality that we think about through a sociological lens, can be shown to have real effects on, what people consume, what people like, what people hate, what people find cool and authentic, what people find, ugly and sell out or whatever. Bourdieu's work is particularly useful for thinking about this, and I'll talk about that later. When we look about the ways that people consume, we can also then link that to the different kind of morals, values, and ethics that dominate a society, and how that kind of interrelates with broader social issues and problems. Now, just before I move into part 3 of the lecture overall, but part 2 of the conceptual part, I just wanted to quickly highlight Daniel Miller's work, who's kind of the anti-Frankfurt theorist, who, I suppose, agrees somewhat with it that the consumption of things can be ideological, but argues that really the way that we interact with things is much more than that. His book, The Comfort of Things, is particularly a really great read. It's one of those rare social science books that's beautifully written. And in that work, Miller and his colleagues did this kind of study down one street in London, where they went into 100 households over a kind of yearly period, I think, and got people to talk about their stuff and observe them talking to their stuff. And what Miller argues is that people's attachment to things and their ownership of stuff can be ideological, but often goes way beyond that. That we form kind of these important relationships with objects because they actually come to represent our relations with others or with important times in our lives, good times, bad times. And this means that, for Miller, that consumption relationships aren't necessarily as superficial as the Frankfurt School argue. So in that book, there's some wonderful snippets about, examples of this. There's the middle-class mum, kind of upper middle-class mum who had a pretty fraught relationship with her quite kind of bougie, snooty, snobby parents who didn't, really want to, have them in her life that much anymore, and didn't really like the house she grew up in because it was full of kind of old furniture, expensive antique furniture that's really hard to open and close. So she deliberately shopped at IKEA because she didn't want her children to experience, that kind of frustration. She also deliberately took her kids to McDonald's once a week to have dinner or lunch or something, even though this kind of really annoyed her, professional middle class friends as well, who, in terms of taste culture, saw that as irresponsible. But what she talks about when she goes to McDonald's, for instance, is how they would get the Happy Meal. There'd be a particular toy when they were going there. It was from a particular country around the world. I think it was a Snoopy or something. And then after they would eat the meal and do the little puzzle on the tray, they would go home with the, Snoopy from Iceland or whatever, and then go and look up that country. And then, she would have these kind of, fun moments of learning with her kids. And there's another guy in the study that was a former heroin addict that used his record collection and his photos, that when he felt like he was going to have a relapse, he would get those things out to make him think about good times, and make him think about get a photo out of his daughter to kind of make him think about how he, didn't want to get back on the gear. So again, here things become this, real meaningful objects in our lives. So you can see there's a real tension in the social sciences about how consumption works. On the one end of the scale, you have this kind of idea that people are cultural dupes, blindly consuming ideologically. On the more anthropological end, there's work that kind of talks about how things have always been really important in the ways that humans relate and socialise.